In Lab 5, you are going to be exploring enzymes. Now, enzymes are proteins. Enzymes are proteins that speed up chemical reactions. Enzymes are proteins that speed up chemical reactions by lowering the activation energy. So the activation energy is basically how much energy it takes to start a reaction. So enzymes speed up reactions that can happen anyway. They just obviously make them happen faster. So the enzyme we're going to be working with for most of the experiments in Lab 5 is catalase. So catalase is an enzyme that speeds up this very specific chemical reaction that involves H2O2 or hydrogen peroxide. The same stuff you have under your sink at home, right? That hydrogen peroxide, when mixed with catalase, will break down into water and oxygen. Now this, again, can happen naturally. This is why hydrogen peroxide is stored in a dark bottle at your house, right? So that this doesn't happen as quickly. But catalase just makes it happen faster. So we're going to be measuring this experiment by looking at how many bubbles are actually made at the end. Now those bubbles are oxygen, right? So we can't measure the water because it looks basically the same as the solutions that we have in front of us. But the catalase is going to take the hydrogen peroxide, break it down into water, and then the bubbles are what we actually see. And if you've ever used hydrogen peroxide, you know this, right? It bubbles, even on your own skin. Why? Because your skin has catalase that breaks down the hydrogen peroxide and also helps to control things like bacterial infections, or if you've ever had an ear piercing, that's basically what you use as a hydrogen peroxide solution. So in this experiment, or in this whole lab, you're going to be running multiple experiments to look at what happens under certain situations. But the very first thing you need to do is to show that what I'm telling you is true. Basically, that catalase is going to work on hydrogen peroxide. Now, the other unique thing about proteins in general is that they have a very specific shape, what we call the quaternary shape. And that shape has to accommodate whatever it's working on, which is why enzymes like catalase really only have one reactant, or what's called a substrate. So the catalase is the enzyme. It has a pocket inside of it that's called the active site that the hydrogen peroxide is going to fit right into. Now, the first experiment is to show, yes, catalase actually works on hydrogen peroxide and that it doesn't work on other things, right? We don't just get bubbles because catalase is mixed with other things. So in this experiment, you are looking at 4 different substrates or potential substrates. Test tube 1 here has a little bit of water at the bottom of it. All right, test tube 2 has the hydrogen peroxide in it. Test tube 3 has a solution of glucose in it. And then the last one has a protein, which is albumin, which is like an egg protein, just to test it. So then what we're going to do is add catalase. Now I've made this catalase by mixing up a potato smoothie. Basically, literally, I threw a potato in a blender, and that gives you a solution of catalase. So this pipette that I'm using is about I'm getting about 1.5 mils out of this solution, and we're going to put it into each one. Now, when you do this, you're going to want to do it gently to make sure that you don't add any like turbulence to the solution to see what happens when you mix. So I'm going to add 1.5 to each, and we're going to see what happens. So even as you're looking at it now, you can see that test tube 1 basically is doing nothing. All right, so let's bring this a little bit closer. Test tube 1, nothing's happening, right? There are no bubbles that are reacting. Test tube 2, however, you see that there are bubbles forming on the surface. Now in the lab, this is what you're going to be measuring, right? You would physically take a ruler and you would measure this out after 20 seconds. 3 and 4, also nothing, right? No bubbles. There's a couple there from turbulence, so maybe you get a little bit of bubble that you would be recording in your table for procedure 1 in your lab. But without even measuring, you can already see that, yeah, test tube 2 is the one that is working, right? Dramatically in comparison to test tube 1, for example, which is water. So if you look closely, you can actually see the bubbles. I'm just going to keep it back here. The focus isn't focusing. The bubbles inside of the solution are getting forced up to the top. Those are oxygen bubbles. That is the oxygen that is being produced during this reaction, and that is what we are going to physically measure. So in 5.1, what you are doing is just verifying that yes, catalase works on hydrogen peroxide and not the other substances that are here.